From the archives of the great library of Arathes, Golden City of Elves, the wise scholars of Grey Sage present the unlikely and highly questionable accounts from those who were avowed witness. These are the suspenseful investigations of the human, Fraenk Neversleep, Arch-Preceptor of Blackroot. And now, the Neversleep Scrolls, Circle of the Mind Thief, written by Philip Walton. The story continues. Chapter 40. Although trial by combat was extremely rare in elven society, there were several instances throughout their history which suggested it did happen. In each case, they were the deciding factor of weighty matters of great import, such as which brother a particular princess would marry, an exiled lord seeking justice over a stolen birthright, or single combat between two honourable commanders to save the bloodshed of their armies. On the other hand, duels were far more common amongst humans, who seemed to use it for dispute resolution in matters both great and completely petty. Fraenk recalled an instance in his own district, where a man was stabbed over an argument regarding how brown a particular stray dog was. The answer, medium brown. Fraenk had never personally participated in a duel. He believed himself to be smarter than that and would not allow himself to get drawn into one. Usually he was able to resolve a conflict one way or another before matters degraded, to the point where single combat became the determinant. Most often, another round of ale was the most effective way to disarm any argument, and if that failed, preemptive violence. Duels were another matter entirely. They expected participants to follow a set of rules to make them fair, which Fraenk considered any fight where he did not have the clear advantage not worth the risk. And they nearly always resulted in bodily injury for one or both parties at a minimum, and quite frequently death. And what did one win in such risky contests? Typically, it was a slight increase in one's own nebulous concept of honour, or just bragging rights over besting a dead man. Which that, and a few copper coins, could buy you a roll in the sheets with any girl in the Canal Street cat houses. All were solid reasons why it was a pastime for fools. And yet, for all his caution, here Fraenk found himself in a duel with the High Lord of Arathes himself. As he recalled, there were many regional variations on how to conduct oneself in a combat trial. Sometimes the winner was the one who drew blood first. In others, points were given for each successful hit. Since there seemed to be no officiant or oversight of any kind for this sudden and unexpected contest, Fraenk had to assume that things automatically defaulted to primal fight guidelines, of which there were only two. The first and really most important rule was to not die. This was fairly self-explanatory and easily understood. Being alive was generally the condition that all aspired to remain, and it made things a lot easier if one wanted to brag about being a successful disputant afterwards. It was, unfortunately, the rule that half of the participants could not uphold. The second rule was just as easy to understand, but a lot more challenging to perform. It was simply to kill the other guy. Or short of that, maim, disembowel, disarticulate, exsanguinate, incapacitate, or otherwise force them into complete trouser-wetting submission. It was this second rule which now put Fraenk in a most unusual dilemma. "I yield, my lord," Fraenk said immediately, and raised his hands as fat drops of blood crawled down his cheek. Krispen Whiteleaf stared back with wild, unfocused eyes that followed him, but didn't seem to see Fraenk at all.
"I challenge you to a duel, Neversleep,"
he cackled and waggled the point of the blade at Frank's chest. Neversleep stepped back out of reach of the sword as Whiteleaf laughed again, high and crazed. "I yield!" Fraenk shouted more insistently. Then twice more at all the gathered elves, who by then had backed away to the far corners of the hall and away from the sword-wielding maniac. Even the guards in the room looked at a loss for how to handle this, torn between their duty to both protect and obey the High Lord Elf. No one seemed eager to put a stop to this mad display, no one except Brightrock.
"My lord, you've had an eventful evening,"
Fraenk heard the arch-partisan say from behind him in a soothing voice that he almost didn't recognize. It was so disarming that Fraenk almost lowered his own hands and turned to gaze astonished at the grizzled old elf. But Whiteleaf would not be placated by words.
Silence, Barotic.
Lord Whiteleaf seemed to falter when recalling the elf's name, but he recovered quickly.
Against the wall with the others, I want to duel with Neversleep, a proper duel.
Fraink's heart sank as he heard reluctant footsteps recede back from him. He was truly alone now. "I can't, my lord," Fraenk said, trying to find some valid reason.
No, you can't.
Krispen Whiteleaf's smile was all teeth.
Not without a weapon. Get Neversleep a proper sword.
Fraenk wasn't sure who, but someone then slid a sword that came clanking and jangling across the floor to his foot. It reminded him of the trident that Kyla had passed him when he was facing off against the Shade Scourge. He nearly wished that was what he was facing right now. His rules of engagement would at least be clear.
Pick it up!
Whiteleaf gestured excitedly with his own blade. Fraenk hesitated, casting about the room for anyone who might come to his defence, or even a mere suggestion of how to proceed. Even lifting a weapon in the direction of the High Lord was big trouble, especially for a human. No one seemed to want to interject themselves into any part of this, especially not after seeing the near-headless guard lying in the middle of the floor. The general consensus seemed to be to just let the High Lord kill Fraenk, and then afterwards maybe a light dessert. Krispen Whiteleaf grew impatient and slashed the air in front of Fraenk's face, chopping away a small bit of his collar. That was too close.
Do it, or I'll kill you where you stand.
Reluctantly, Fraenk stooped and grabbed the sword, keeping his eyes fixed on the young High Lord, whose head was now tilted to one side, and a thin string of saliva was spilling down from the corner of his mouth. There seemed to be nothing of the polite and curious elf he had met earlier in the evening. Gingerglade's magical influence had twisted him into some kind of monster. Fraenk quickly searched for his true enemy amongst the crowd, while trying to keep Lord Whiteleaf in his periphery. He caught just a glimpse of Gingerglade, hands still frosted over, and standing between the Fernbrook houseguards.
"Fraenk, watch out!"
He heard an older woman shout as the High Lord launched himself forward with a wild series of swings. Fraenk was only passable as a swordsman, and barely managed to completely parry 3 of the 4 attacks. He felt pain in his side, and an oozing warmth made the fabric cling to his body. The High Lord was young and fast. He had clearly been receiving top training in martial skills. "Good show, sir. You've drawn blood. You are the victor." Fraenk grunted, giving a slight but cautious bow. He kept the sword point down, but ready to counter.
That's just a drop, Neversleep. I want all of it.
High Lord Whiteleaf screeched. He swung again, but Fraenk stepped back out of range.
"Don't hurt him, Fraenk."
He heard the old woman call to him again, and realised it was Lady Blackroot. She and the High Council lords from her side of the dais had moved back to the far side of the room, but she was at least trying to help. "I wouldn't think of it, my lady," Fraenk called back. "You're not suggesting that I throw this duel, are you? He's trying to kill me."
"There's worse things than a quick death, boy,"
Lord Fernbrook chimed in.
"You'll discover all of them if you harm our beloved High Lord."
"You!" Fraenk stomped towards Fernbrook until Whiteleaf slid directly into his path.
I challenge you to a duel!
The High Lord shouted again. Fraenk saw there was something wrong with one or both of Krispen Whiteleaf's eyes, for they were pointing in different directions. He smacked his forehead hard several times, then straightened again. Whatever Gingerglade was doing, it was wreaking havoc on this poor elf's mind. Fraenk knew he needed to put an end to this, and quickly or the High Lord would end up vacuous, like the human gang leader Joeth. But it wasn't going to be easy. As if to emphasize this, High Lord Whiteleaf shot forward with a blistering series of slashes, cuts and jabs. His form was flawless, and his years of instruction from the best instructors were on full display. Fraenk's own sword could not keep up, and he staggered backward with 6 fresh cuts on his body. The look Krispen gave said what they both knew. He could have easily killed Fraenk right there. Then Whiteleaf capered backwards with a series of hopping steps, darkly whimsical and theatric.
This is fun. Are you having fun, Neversleep?
Whiteleaf asked, then attacked again. But this time he appeared to be struggling much more. His swings were slow and telegraphed. Sensing his opening, Fraenk pressed this advantage. He parried 2 cuts, then 2 more before sidestepping an awkward overhand chop that left Whiteleaf wrong-footed. Fraenk swung his own blade as Krispen Whiteleaf turned, defenceless. Frank's sword edge sang right for the High Lord's exposed neck. Whiteleaf's hands were down at his sides, and he stood, blinking and looking confused. Fraenk realized this at the last moment. He fought the momentum of his own swing, somehow miraculously stopping the slash inches from High Lord Krispen Whiteleaf's skin. Several people in the onlooking crowd shrieked or gasped. The High Elf sucked in a breath, looking confused and scared. It was that moment when Fraenk realized Gingerglade had released his hold, giving the High Lord back his mind at the moment when he would have had his own throat opened by the first human he'd ever met. It was diabolical and malevolent. Fraenk dropped his sword with a clatter. This was madness. Then, to his horror, Fraenk watched Whiteleaf's eyes roll back again, and the Richter's smile peel back from his teeth.
Ooh, I thought I had you with that one, Fraenk.
Gingerglade's words came out of Whiteleaf's mouth. "You'll die for this," Fraenk said low.
Come and get me, Neversleep.
The puppeted elf began to laugh. The crowd seemed to have recovered from the shock and were now a chorus of angry shouts. "He tried to kill the High Lord! Assassin! Guards! Arrest him!" Now all the guards, who had previously stood back while Fraenk was nearly cut to ribbons, rushed forward to the defence of their sovereign.
It's your time to die, Fraenk.
Whiteleaf began to say, his eyes rolling wildly in their sockets. Something was very wrong. The elf's mind was about to break. He needed to hold on until Fraenk could figure out how to save him. Just hold on. Then Fraenk had a sudden and probably terrible idea. Before the High Lord could lift his blade again, Fraenk launched himself forward, wrapping both arms tightly around Krispen Whiteleaf.
What are you doing, Fraenk?
He heard Lady Blackroot shriek from across the room. All the guards stopped in their tracks, unsure of what was happening. It wasn't an attack necessarily, but more of an enthusiastic hug.
What? What is this? Unhand me!
Whiteleaf struggled. He still clutched his own sword, but couldn't swing it with his arms pinned tightly to his sides. At least Whiteleaf was unable to hack him to death like this. But how long could Fraenk hold on to him? Then the second part of this bad idea came to him. Fraenk certainly couldn't best the elf in a sword fight. He was much too big and slow for that, not to mention the wide difference in skill. But in a contest of wrestling, Frank's size and strength did put him at the advantage. And there was nothing he loved more than an unfair fight when it was in his favour. "My lord, may I ask for this dance?" Fraenk smiled, then lifted the elf off his feet. They spun together like some mockery of lovers or performers, Krispen Whiteleaf screeching and Fraenk stepping lightly on his toes. The elf's sword point swung in an arc with them, backing off the encroaching guards. Fraenk moved them together across the floor, heading directly for his intended target, Faratil Gingerglade and the necklace. The Arch-Preceptor of Fernbrook had his eyes pinched shut, but he must have been able to see through Whiteleaf's because he faltered when the bizarre couple spun towards him. Fraenk timed his steps and movement. He would only have one chance at this. As he anticipated, the Fernbrook guards saw their approach and stepped back, leaving Gingerglade standing by himself. All Fraenk had to do was let go of the High Lord at the right moment and trade him for a new dance partner, one that he was planning to destroy if the fates would allow it. Then the moment came and Fraenk opened his arms, allowing High Lord Whiteleaf to spin backward, safely and a bit dizzy, out into the open space of the Grand Hall. The first movement of Frank's dangerous dance executed perfectly. Fraenk spun again, stepping quickly, and caught sight of Gingerglade. His hands reached out to grab the elf, to grip his neck and squeeze until cartilage snapped and bones broke. But something awful happened. Frank's feet stopped moving, then his hands too were frozen. His entire body refused to obey any command. It was like he was paralyzed, for nothing he did, no matter how hard he tried, could make himself move. Then something much more unnerving occurred. Fraenk felt his body move, but he was no longer in control of it. He stood straight up with his arms hanging loosely at his side.
Looks like I'm the one who has you, Fraenk.
He heard the delightedly sinister voice of Farathiel Gingerglade say inside his mind. Thank you for listening. Tune in next week for another exciting episode. And remember, the learned scholars of Greysage caution you that the veracity of these events remains unproven. Now go safe in the light of the powers, until our hands clasp again.